Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Regulatory Voices. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Bhargavi Pandit. Bhargavi, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Corner. I am delighted to be talking with you today. Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. I think it'd be really good, as usual, if you could tell everyone a little bit about yourself, kind of a high-level overview, and what you're doing today.
Sure, happy to. I've spent the last 15 years or so in regulatory affairs and almost entirely focused on oncology, immunology, and rare diseases, which I think honestly turned out to be a perfect intersection of science and strategy for me. I actually started with a Bachelor of Pharmacy back in India, and then I came to the US to pursue my graduate studies in regulatory affairs at Northeastern. What really drew me to this field was realizing that regulatory is not just something about checking boxes or filing paperwork. That's what comes to mind when we think of it first, but it's really about translating that cutting edge science into a story that health authorities can engage with. And ultimately, it's also about getting patients to the medications and the innovative drugs that we have who mostly need them. I would say my career really started with Sun Pharma, and then I moved on to GSK, where I got some experience with global filing. But things really took off for me when I started with Boehringer Ingelheim because working in oncology was my passion. And I started off working in immuno-oncology with the company. And it really gave me experience with the early phase drug development and really shaping the regulatory strategy there before the molecule even could hit the clinic. It was a great experience and a foundation stepping stone for me. From there, I moved on to AstraZeneca. So that's where I led most of the late stage filing in terms of global strategy. And specifically, one of the highlights in my career was leading the first in-class approval for TrueCap, which is a breast cancer drug through the NDA. We managed to secure a fast-track designation, priority review, Project Orbis, so pretty much everything under the sun within the regulatory landscape for approval. So I think that was a huge milestone for me, not only personally, but also for the patients as I think about it. From there, I had the opportunity to move on to Karyopharm, where I led global regulatory teams for regulatory strategy, labeling, and pediatric development for selinexor across several cancer types. And that also included some important conversations and FDA negotiations on some precedent-setting novel endpoints for rare diseases. Most recently, as you know, I've joined Galderma as a global head of regulatory in immunology, where I'm really building out a global organization that can work on different indications for nemolizumab, shaping up the pediatric strategy, working on expanding nemolizumab to other countries where it's not approved yet. So if I really have to sum it up, I think my career has been this steady progression from execution to strategy to now almost building organizations and shaping how regulatory science gets integrated into drug development right from day one. And if I have to say what truly keeps me hooked is this way through in every single one of the programs, at the end of the day, it's about getting a treatment and a medicine for patients who are waiting for it. So that truly drives and motivates me.
Perfect. Thank you for summarizing the journey and kind of the purpose and mission behind it. It's always good to remember why people do these things, because it's not an easy job. It is very stressful. There's a lot of accountability and responsibility on the line. Looking back at your career so far, you've worked across large biotech, now Galderma, but the group you're in is kind of a small group in a big group. So you've worked in very different types of setups and environments. How has those companies and the size you've worked in shaped the way you think about regulatory?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think with larger organizations, you don't have a lot of ability to change a lot of processes. So you're bound by some of the systems that are already in place. You're bound by some of the ways of working that are already in place. But I think early on in my career, I needed that because I was coming in so fresh. I really wanted to understand what a good process looks like or what a good system looks like. So that foundation was very important for me when I started with Boehringer Ingelheim and GSK and AstraZeneca. That gave me that foundation of what good looks like, but also gave me an insight on what repetitive might look like or overburdening of processes might look like. So when I went into more nimble organizations like Karyopharm and that had more flatter structures and had to make decisions more quickly, I had the ability to also grasp that and appreciate why decisions are made quickly in biotechs versus large pharma. So that really helped me shape some of my ways of working and thinking as well. The smaller organizations gave me a lot of insight in terms of beyond regulatory, because you're sitting on a lot of cross-functional teams. You are fewer people working in an organization. So that really helped me shape my overall view on drug development. I was not working in silos anymore. I understood why a probability of regulatory success is important. It goes into forecasting for commercial. Why I am building a strategy that is 5 years out, because that determines the landscape of that molecule. So I think that mix of exposure gave me the opportunity to think about regulatory strategy just beyond the function. And I think that's how I try to also adapt when my team comes to me with an issue or a concern on why do we do certain things within regulatory that are not needed right now. It's that forward-looking thinking that I can apply from these different organizations that I have worked in that really helps me shape that strategy that's not just useful to a regulator, ultimately going to the FDA, but to the company that's going to market and launch the product ultimately.
You mentioned before in your introduction how passionate you were about oncology, but now you're working more in the immunology space. What made that transition interesting for you?
Yeah, so when I was looking at what my next role would look like, if you know me and now that you will hear me through the podcast, you know that I am the one that would love to get out of my comfort zone and challenge the norm. And considering that oncology has been the pioneering space of bringing in novel endpoints, dynamic pathways within regulatory, that was something that I always strive to apply within different therapeutic areas. So one of the things that really attracted me was the way Galderma is building within the immunology space, the opportunity to really go and push that envelope in the right direction from a regulatory strategy perspective. So if you looked at the recent FDA pilots, the remarks that were made by ex-commissioner Dr. Macri on maybe having one pivotal trial only for all indications. How can we move faster? How can we rely on some external data? That was already being done in oncology. And I knew that there is so much potential that we can leverage from that field into bringing some of these simpler, easier, faster ways of working into the immunology space too. So I think that really drew me in terms of how much parallel I could draw from my experience, but also how much investment I could make from a regulatory standpoint by getting that seat on the table from a different therapeutic area perspective and still really enhance drug development as it's moving forward. So that was one of the things that truly attracted me in moving into a different therapeutic area, which would give me the opportunity to apply what I've learned within oncology and borrow it almost and see how I can use that within a different space and landscape.
Was there a particular point in your career where regulatory moved from being a function you worked in to something you saw as a strategic leadership role? Or is it kind of one of those things where you're always operational and always being a strategic leader? Because I feel like with the cross-functional element of regulatory, you kind of are acting as a mini leader all the time because you're always going into different groups and asking for things.
Yeah, this is such a great topic to talk about because if you look at the broader regulatory affairs function, right, it's fragmented into a lot of different things. It's fragmented into regulatory strategy, regulatory operations, regulatory CMC, regulatory intelligence, and they all sit under this broader regulatory affairs umbrella. But you cannot look at those functions in silos because they all work together. And then more to your point, I think the drug development was moving towards more of a innovative landscape than being a check in the box. That's where regulatory truly, I feel, got a seat on the table. And again, from my oncology experience, because we had so many novel pathways that came about, we started moving into precision medicine. The space started becoming crowded. It was extremely important for regulatory to have that seat on the table early on, not at the end, because if the strategy has completely been sorted out, we had no space to play. And we were going to be negotiating to a regulator with information that we probably didn't even believe in. So I think that's where my true inflection point came, and in oncology the most, because it's so fast and, it's great for the patients, but then we also have to make sure that from a sponsor perspective, perspective, it's relevant to the patients and to the treatment landscape that we're going in. So I've seen that inflection point first truly within the oncology space. And now that I work in immunology, I can say is also coming into this space where regulatory strategy truly has a seat on the table. Especially, we're seeing so many companies invest in different trials as we unlock the potential of these drugs into different mechanism of actions on how can we carve our niche? How can we design a trial that is most relevant to the patients? So for me, I think I'm striving for that still, because sometimes I do feel we get missed out of conversations and wish we had an opportunity to get earlier on, but I'm striving that within my current organization and making sure that we can truly be partners, and the players, the cross-functional players, view us as partners.
I want to do a bit of a slight pivot into something that you've discussed a few times, and it is the hot topic. I feel like I can't go an episode without talking about AI, but there is a lot of excitement around it right now, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. And you were quite excited about some of the pilots that the FDA's got going on right now, the new ways of working, how companies are trying to understand where AI can actually add value. And regulatory teams, as you told me and other people have told me, are being asked to think about how this changes strategy, evidence generation, and internal decision making. Wow. So my first question to you on this would be, when people talk about AI and regulatory today, where do you think the conversation is useful, and where do you think it becomes a bit too much hype?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, and as you mentioned, a hot topic. We've been discussing a lot within our teams as well. So where I think that AI is genuinely useful right now is in the operational layer of regulatory work. Things like compiling ECTDs, doing first pass literature screening, or even drafting your first draft of labeling language, looking at a reference, or some type of gap analysis when you're doing a global submission. These are tasks usually that are, high volume, they're somewhat repetitive. So I think AI can take a draft from a blank page to almost 80% when we're looking at such operational heavy tasks. And that's not a small thing, because it means that you're freeing up your good regulatory professionals to do the work that they're hired to do, which is, do strategy, work around what the health authority engagement would look like, anticipating how the agency would react to a certain data package. So I think that's huge. Where I think it really is becoming a hype is when people start talking about AI as if it's going to replace the regulatory judgment in itself. Whether it's going to tell you the outcome of an AdCom, or if FDA will accept an endpoint or not. I think we are not there yet. And frankly speaking, I don't think that we're going to be there anytime soon, because so much of what we do actually depends on the relationships that we've made. Reading the room, understanding that unwritten context between a health authority comment and advice that we're trying to seek. So I think AI can really help us prepare for conversations, but I don't think they can have the conversations for us at this time. And the one place that you mentioned, right, when companies think about AIs and when the companies really try to enforce that we have to incorporate AI in some way, I really want to flag where the hype versus reality truly becomes an issue is when you start having AI generated content and submissions. I think that's where FDA has been very clear based on their new guidance that they are expecting a human in the loop. They are expecting full audit trails. And that's where the scrutiny comes in. We've recently seen a warning letter go to a company that used AI to generate batch records and generate specifications without having any human in the loop. And that is somewhere FDA will really come down heavy on you, or a health authority will come down heavy on you. So if the company's strategy is, hey, let me have AI write everything, and then one person will have a glance before it goes off, that's not a shortcut. I think that's a liability waiting to surface. So if I have to sum it up, my honest take is AI is a phenomenal force multiplier for the mechanics of some of the regulatory operation work, but it's also additive to the expertise. It's not going to be substitute for it, right? The companies that are going to be winning are the ones that are going to truly be treating in a way where they can free up their best people with high value strategic thinking to do the job that they're supposed to do, but not a way to cut down on people and replace it with AI.
Yeah. And I agree with you on a lot of those things. And I don't want to get too technical or too impassioned, but I've said it on a few times on a few podcasts and people regularly on the phone. I think drug development is a uniquely human endeavor. It is humans putting together everything we've learned throughout all of history, all our current research, and trying to help other humans. And you have to have accountability and responsibility. And you can't make code responsible. You can't make code accountable. And I think there's also a misunderstanding of what current AI models are. A lot of them are language models where it is simply relying on a data set it has from its training and trying to guess the next word. That's just not going to work for technical submissions where the FDA is, again, is hoping a human has gone through its data and gone, okay, what does it do? Because an AI is simply going to guess what the next word is. And as we now know, a lot of these algorithms are trained to just make you feel happy. They want you to be happy with the output.
Absolutely. They want to spit out the right answer, right?
Yeah.
They want to make you happy. You are so on point with that corner. And even if we think about all of these LLM models that you mentioned, I think they're also trained on base of the data sets that we input in them.
Yeah.
And if you have selected quite cherry-picked data sets to only spit out information that you would like, that's a problem right there.
I mean, it's one of those things where it is improving, and I think a lot of the hype and a lot of the excitement we see around AI is about what AI can be, not necessarily a reflection of what AI is now. And I think that's again, that's a whole other beast of a topic about the overinflation of AI. So maybe we can scoot past that and just go back to regulatory. So to wrap that little bit up there, then, how do you think regulatory leaders should think about AI without losing that scientific and regulatory judgment? Because essentially that's what it comes down to. It's the balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we should all look at AI as our partners, but also having enough oversight and human in the loop. I think implementing AIs for simpler tasks for companies that are just starting to implement AIs, I would start with more simpler tasks in terms of, label, draft language, gap analysis, reading through, or if you have translations, making sure the translations are accurate, and slowly ramp up from there as the capabilities of AI increase. I absolutely don't think that we should be relying on AIs for scientific narratives, for submission, heavy documentation that requires more human engagement than just a mere oversight.
And obviously, we've discussed a little bit about these FDA pilots, and without naming some of them. But obviously, the FDA and agencies around the world are trying to move quickly in this space. So, from your perspective, in your position, what does that mean for companies trying to plan development programs today when these pilots are coming out and then have to be rehashed and a new one comes out and you're trying to plan out for 3, 5, 10 years?
Yeah, this is a really live topic right now. And I think what we're seeing is that FDA is signaling that they are also all in. They want to make sure that they have the AI guidance. That's why they have the pilots, the AI assisted review that the FDA follows now as well, so that they can move fast and reduce some of this friction in the system as well. And they're even talking about, as I mentioned, moving away from a lot of animal studies where we can use modeling and we can use simulation to go forward with some of those approaches, moving away from a traditional true trial design to like one pivotal trial by default, supporting it with additional data sets. So I think the direction of travel is clear here, that the agency obviously wants to be more nimble, more flexible, especially when we're thinking about accelerated pathways, unmet medical need. But what I tell my teams always is a faster agency doesn't mean less rigor. I think it, in fact, is shifting the rigor right now where it lives. So if FDA is willing to move quickly, the burden is actually falling on the sponsors to come to the table with a regulatory strategy that's robust from day one. Not something you bolt out after your phase 2 data comes in. That means things like endpoints, your biomarker strategy, your engagement plan with the agency has to be built right from the start. If you want to be part of pilots that the agency has put together, we have to have that discussion right from the start, not after the trial is halfway through, not after we have not analyzed our resources and capabilities. So ideally, I even tell the team sometimes that it's even before you finalize your clinical protocols, to be honest, because that's where the true decision making happens and brainstorming happens. I think the other practical implementation around the AI tools itself and agencies thinking, and as companies look forward to what's coming next, is for spotting inconsistencies in your submission and companies assuming that there's going to be a different kind of scrutiny now, that was 5 years ago. That is truly raising the bar. With FDA using tools that can spot inconsistencies and have gap analysis done quickly and more thoroughly, that's also raising bar on data integrity from our side, having cleaner audit trails, because now even sponsors are going to be relying on some of these tools before it goes to the FDA using those tools. So I think making sure that everything is well documented, everything is defensible when the time of inspection comes into place, and making sure that we're compliant. FDA has good artificial intelligence practices now. So making sure that we have incorporated that within the company's SOPs and working instructions before we start talking about a new tool coming into picture is going to be extremely important. One thing that I advise my team is please don't treat regulatory as a downstream function. And a function that will just react on data. Bring regulatory strategy onto the table when you are at the designing stage. We can be partners with the biostats team, the clinical team, the translational medicine team. So we can open up some of these accelerated opportunities and find a path that would fit in terms of the company's scope of pace as well as what FDA is expecting. So that has been my one ask, and that is what I'm currently also striving for, that getting that regulatory space in the room early on so we can shape the science and we can partner with the technology that the company wants to bring in right from the get-go.
I was going to ask as a follow-up, how should companies monitor and interpret these signals from the agencies? But I feel like you've covered it a little bit. So I suppose I'll flip it on to what should regulatory teams be careful not to assume too early? Because that, again, is where the hype of it comes in. As you said, don't treat it like a downstream. You're not a data drip. You're not just data. There's more to it. What would you say teams should be careful about?
Yeah, the one thing that I would say is a watch out is don't take everything as face value, because you hear about pilots and you hear about real-time AE monitoring. You hear about real-time submissions. I will say, having had the opportunity to work in larger organizations where it was easier to manage some of that with the resources versus working in leaner organizations that probably did not have the capability, it's not as easy as it seems or looks like. If a company truly wants to invest themselves in a pilot, I think that's great, but just make sure that we also understand and appreciate the resourcing and the additional work and some of the openness that we are willing to create with the FDA and the transparency that we are willing to create with the FDA, where all companies may not be as comfortable as some of the larger organizations.
If I can pick on the aspect of your career where you have done small, mid-size and large, and you know what sort of infrastructure there is, how much budget there is, and how much internal expertise and SMEs you have access to, how should smaller and mid-sized companies think about AI when they most definitely do not have that infrastructure, budget, or access to as many SMEs as, say, like some of the top 10 who can just implement a new AI forward-focused strategy when they can put millions and billions behind it?
Yeah, that's a fun one to think about, right? If you have a big pot of money and now how can you invest into AI? I think first and foremost, I think the one thing that we will have to change is the relationship between regulatory and data. Because right now, even with all the progress that we've made on the modeling and AI, regulatory strategy truly follows build the evidence, bring it to the agency rhythm. So I think for me, the one thing that I would say if a company is truly looking to shift from that traditional model to AI is to first really understand how can they scale up their capabilities eventually to that position. I don't think that a company starting off with AI should directly go into a pilot with the FDA where they're looking at real-time adverse event signals without the company having that confidence in that space. Unless the drug was approved, they already know what the safety signal looks like, etc. So I think scaling up gradually is going to be key. Ensuring that you're still having one SME per function sit during that scaling. So if we say that a smaller company wants to scale in terms of regulatory submissions, we would start off by saying, let's start with a pilot on IND and CTAs. Then let's gradually move on to maybe briefing books that are more content heavy. Then let's move on to submissions that are NDAs or BLAs. So I think for me, that trend is important because no matter the size of the company, the rigor and the quality of work that we would have to produce with the FDA is going to be the same. So I think phasing it out in that sense is going to be the best bet, where companies can not only understand their internal capabilities, but also start building that trust with the health authorities and with the agencies as they move along implementing AI within different aspects of regulatory.
I think if we kind of take a step out of the AI side of things and go a little bit back into more of the established status quo at the moment of regulatory strategy. Something you've talked about it when doing global regulatory is how different agencies and health authorities move at different speeds. Many companies try to think globally from the start, but obviously the environment is always not aligned and it's always changing. FDA may be moving quickly on certain initiatives, while other authorities may be more cautious, slower, or simply operating from a different framework. FDA is one country's agency, EMA is a whole host of countries, so it's not apples and apples. And so that starts to create a bit of a tension strategically, and when companies are trying to design studies, plan filings, and try to avoid delays. So my first question to you on this sort of area would be, when a company is planning global development, how difficult is it to manage different expectations across, let's say, FDA, EMA, PMDA, China, and obviously rest of world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to say, oncology has probably been the best training ground for this because of how fast not only the landscape shifts, but also how quickly agencies have to adapt to their thinking. So when it comes to global strategies, I think it is extremely important first to understand which key markets do we really want to go in. It is not possible to have 100 registrations going at the same time, just from a strategic perspective, from a resource perspective. So if we take some of the top agencies, as you mentioned, FDA, EMA, China is really getting on board with some of the initiatives as well, especially in the oncology and the immunology space. I think it will be very, very important to understand what our patient population is and how does that patient population reflect in these countries, because that's going to be your basis of really driving your indication or regulatory strategy. Second, being very coherent in your scientific rationale and your scientific development through this to not have published as many papers or guidances as the FDA. They are reasonable enough when it comes to having robust strategy and scientific rationale brought into them for the right condition. So having conditional approvals in EMA, just like accelerated approvals in the US, or working along with a China bridging strategy just for the Chinese patients once we have data in the ex-China population. All of those strategies are well known and can be well incorporated. So I would say that don't shy away from engagements with global health authorities simultaneously. Sometimes we do fear that too much feedback would be very hard to incorporate. But I think if we have a good basis of scientific understanding of our molecule, of our disease type, of our patient population, having parallel scientific advice, getting into pilots where different agencies talk to each other at different times. MHRA recently had a pilot where they want to be at the forefront and are really making sure that they have advancement of these innovative drugs and access of innovative drugs to the public in the UK. I think all of this shows a joint effort in a way almost where the agencies want to think alike and will appreciate if the sponsor brings in the data and the sponsor aligns on what the strategy looks like and takes that onus rather than throwing it out to the health authority and asking them to assess the risk. I think that open dialogue goes a long way. And I generally tell my teams that if we are sure that we have a robust clinical development plan, a robust strategy, we should try to go in for parallel scientific advice because that gives us a lot of feedback that we can incorporate earlier on. And even if we are not able to as an organization, we always have to think more globally, whether we are just filing in the US right now in 3 years, you might want to file ex-US. You cannot go back retrospectively and do the
Of
trial
course.
again. So
Yeah.
make sure that you are thinking more globally, even if you just have 1 or 2 markets to capture right now.
Where do you think companies underestimate the complexity of global regulatory?
I think where they underestimate it is in terms of how fast they can move in each country, because each country has different set of requirements. Although we build our strategies more as a global strategy, a global clinical trial, we have sent the CTA applications everywhere. We assume that just an approval of a CTA application would also give us an easy pass going into a registrational trial or going into an MAA or an NDA or a BLA. And I think that's
Yeah.
what they really underappreciated, because once you have the data, once you have the patient population, once you understand the different nuances of the regulation, you go to China or you go to any other Asian market, the dose might be different. How are you incorporating that different dose cohort? Do you have enough sensitivity reports on the ethnic differences between these patient populations? Have you had enough patient population that actually represents that particular region? I think that sometimes is underestimated. And the type of questions that come in from a CTA perspective versus finally an MAA and BLA perspective is also underappreciated sometimes. So I always caution my teams that it's great that we have gone through the first hurdle of a CTA or an IND. That does not automatically translate into an MAA or a BLA approval. We have a long road, and the trials last for years too. So incorporating that change in landscape is extremely important as well.
What do you think are the biggest differences between thinking FDA first and just thinking globally?
I think one of the biggest difference is how nimble and dynamic FDA is how we translate into our trial designs, or how we translate into the inclusion exclusion criterias and ultimately the indications that we go for. So what FDA might agree in terms of an accelerated approval or in terms of a novel endpoint, EMA might not be on the same page for that. And I think that's the difference. And that's where early engagement comes into play, because unless you're a company that's only filing in the US and is only within the US space and dealing with the FDA, that's a different story. But if you are thinking more globally, you just cannot have, for example, a novel endpoint that is agreed upon with the FDA for a global trial design where EMA had no or PMDA had no opportunity to input in it. There are situations where you may use different regulatory statistical strategies to fulfill some of these additional country requirements, because FDA, like I said, is more dynamic, is more willing to incorporate some of these novel trial designs or novel endpoints. So that's where also that strategic fix comes into play, that you go to the FDA first, you get feedback. Is there a mechanism where you don't directly engage with the EMA, but you use some other strategies to incorporate what EMA might need in your statistical plan or in your formal analysis and still satisfy multiple authorities at the same time? So there are differences, but ultimately I will say it all is one key element, that the drug has to be safe. The totality of evidence dictates whether the drug is going to get approved or not. And we always have to focus on benefit versus risk of the drug for our patient population. So that theme for the health authorities is never going to go away.
I mean, you've given some really clear and concise examples where the FDA can move quicker, whereas other countries may not catch up at the same pace. And you gave a few examples of some challenges. What other practical challenges are there? And what does that create for regulatory teams when one is moving a lot quicker, is more, like I said, dynamic and willing to try new things, whereas us just catching up?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons that I have learned, and again, within the oncology space, because we move so fast there, is this urgency and making sure that we provide the drugs that are truly beneficial to the patients as quickly as possible. So the pathways that you see that the FDA has in place, like breakthrough therapy, Project Orbis, Fast Track, these programs are designed because patients cannot wait. And I think what that experience teaches you is how you actually operationalize urgency. How do you run a development program where regulatory milestones, clinical data readouts, even the health authority interactions that you have are tightly choreographed? Because even a few delay of certain months can matter enormously. So I feel that now, even with the immunology and the rare disease space, it's exactly the same position that we are in. The discipline around speed without cutting corners and making sure we still have that rigor is extremely important. I will say that there is one more thing that, maybe is most underrated is how comfortable teams get when we have uncertainty and complexity on a molecular level. In oncology, we may have to run quickly without having all of the data, without understanding everything about the mechanism of action. Oncology pipelines today, as you know, are extremely diverse, right? ADCs, PARPs, novel combinations, bispecifics. And regulatory has to keep up with that pace of science. So it's not just precedence. It's not just, hey, what did they do and let's follow it. So I think the same mindset has to apply throughout the teams, thinking about global strategies that are thinking about immunology, rare disease, wherever you want to apply it, that when we're dealing with complex biologics, novel mechanism of action, it's not going to be a clean regulatory playbook. And we have to get comfortable with that. We have to make sure that even within that space, we understand the rigor that the health authorities are putting on us and provide our submissions accordingly. So I think for me, building teams that can really operate at that level of urgency and complexity and how they can represent regulatory as a true strategic partner and not just a function that signs off is going to be something that is going to be very important for companies as they move along. That's the model that I'm trying to build with my teams. And, that's what I have learned from all of my past experiences as well.
You've given some really nice examples of like how teams have to get comfortable and the teams have to adapt and kind of keep up with it and try and take advantage of all these things. But to flip it on its head, what happens when, say, one authority is comfortable with an approach but another is not?
Yeah.
Does that create like a stop? How do you get through that?
Yeah, and that's more than you can imagine. Sometimes that happens. So it's not new. And this is where I think the risk appetite of an organization also comes into play a little bit, right? So it's not always on just the regulatory team or just the clinical team. This is a more cross-functional decision ultimately. The company decides to make. I think sometimes it also depends on the essence of the feedback or the timing of the feedback. You also don't want to go in too early to all the health authorities without having all of the data in hand. So that's where that regulatory play comes into it as well, where you are staggering that timeline or you're even staggering approvals at that. To a certain extent, where that a health authority that is more dynamic and that is more forward thinking might accept an application and might even review it in a safer space that someone else that doesn't have experience with it. And that's where you truly sit together with your teams to understand what our priorities are and where do we maximize it with the data that we have in hand. We've been in places where we've had a different feedback from FDA, a different feedback from EMA, but we wanted to apply to both of these countries. And that's when you truly decide on what data you can supplement for the health authority that is not 100% on board yet. Is there a timing that we should take care of where let's get the FDA approval first and then we can go to the EMA, or vice versa too sometimes. So it's a broader strategic decision that ultimately has to be made. But I think there are a lot of nuances from a regulatory strategy point of view also that comes into play.
I appreciate that those sorts of conversations do need to happen organizational wide. But given the very nature of regulatory and how a lot of these things, these approvals and strategies do kind of depend on your willingness to try new things and come up with ideas, how do you personally decide when to align globally versus when to just accept that different regions are going to need different strategies?
Yeah, I think it also depends on the type of drug and the disease that you're going into. So from my perspective, if I know that I have 3 other competitors that tried to do the same thing and possibly did not succeed, I would not want to risk it. because I
Sure.
cannot be the fourth one doing the exact same thing and expecting a different result. So a lot of regulatory and competitive intelligence also comes into play then. And
Okay.
I will evaluate the strategy very critically in terms of, do I have a precedence? If the precedence succeeded, if the precedence failed, what public information I can leverage. And if that is the only trial that a smaller company is relying on, I would not want to take that risk. I would actually want to go to multiple health authorities, or at least two big health authorities, to get some idea on what their feedback is. And I tell this to my teams all the time. And especially, sometimes when you're in smaller companies, you're not very comfortable going to the FDA or engaging with the EMA that often. But I think engaging with them at the right time before making a very complex developmental decision is beneficial sometimes, because they can provide us insights that we may not be aware of. Look at thousands of applications every day, and they might have something in their back pocket, even if not directly, in an implied way. And that's where AI cannot help us, and we need a human to interpret that, is incorporate this additional piece, and that might be better for your trial. So it totally depends on the developmental complexity, the complexity of the disease, the complexity of the drug, where I may want to sometimes take a risk. But if I think that the landscape is extremely dynamic, evolving very fast, and that's the only thing that a company might be relying on in terms of getting a positive data, I might suggest let's at least do a parallel scientific advice.
And so, what makes a global regulatory strategy realistic rather than just theoretical?
Yeah, I would say what it truly depends on is, where do you want to go? What your destination is. Because we think about global regulatory strategy and we talk about global regulatory strategy in almost buzzwords now, right? It's global.
Yeah.
We want to
Yeah.
go global. But what does that mean? Global is very big.
Yeah.
Sometimes you cannot go global until you are approved in the US or EU, because the other countries will use you as a reference market. So what does global mean for you? Does it mean that you are going to stagger your applications and go in waves? Or do you want to be part of something like Project Orbis, which is global too, and you are having and hitting a couple of markets at the same time? So I think one of my counter questions to that would be, what do you mean by global? And then once we have decided on that as a company, we can decide whether a Project Orbis for oncology or Access Consortium, as we call it in the immunology realm, makes sense. And that's where then you have to start thinking about globalization of documents, globalization of resources. You're going to be handling multiple countries at the same time. You're probably going to be using ICH templates for your submission as opposed to one region-specific template. Do you have the capabilities to translate everything correctly and answer to the questions as they come along? So I have been in situations where I have done both. I have done global strategies where it's in waves, where we decide based on commercial priorities which country we want to hit first. Or I have done Project Orbis. I have done the Access Consortium for products. And that's when you do global work simultaneously. So it would depend a lot on the company's needs, on where the disease and the product makes sense, and how much capabilities we have in-house to really treat something as global rather than a buzzword.
Something that I think is obviously unique to bigger companies, which I'll admit I don't have too much insight into, is how do you operate globally, say from the US, when your organization has teams in the country you're trying to get approvals for? How do you work with them? How do they factor into that global strategy? Because it kind of seems like it's being driven from, say, the main headquarters and they're just supporting, whereas obviously they're going to have more local domestic knowledge and those relationships. How do you actually factor those into that strategy?
Yeah, the most I would say I have in all my career that I have worked, and although it has been global, I will say that US is always considered the biggest market. So when you think
Okay.
about it, even from a global perspective, almost in a way, it is FDA paving the path for your registration, and the US market being the largest. That's why you will see a lot of global strategies even coming out of the US side
Right.
first,
Sure.
because of the pathways that FDA has created, because the access that we have to the FDA as compared to some of the other health authorities that take a very long time to respond to you, the opportunities to collaborate on pilots with the FDA. So although we talk about the global piece, when we think about the strategic strand front and where we want to launch, most of it is always in the US first. And that's why you always see the US strategy kind of leading it and the global just following it or almost staggering or, falling right behind it. Where it truly makes sense to have that global collaboration is when we are doing something like Project Orbis. That's where you're going to have all of these health authorities look at your application at the same time. They're going to talk to each other. They're going to ask questions to each other that would ultimately come to you. And I think that's where it is important for, as an organization, to feel comfortable and confident in your science. Because every health authority is going to look at it from a different lens, but at the same time. So you should be prepared to say that coherent story together when you are responding to applications. But most of it just comes down to the speed, and it comes down to how quickly we have access to health authorities, which for now has been at the FDA. There are health agencies now that are moving faster, that want drugs to also come to their country first. There is a lot of pilots that are also going to start. China has also upped their game and started a lot of pilots, have worked on a lot of privacy and global documents. So I'm sure that that's going to come in faster than we think. But in all of my career, the global strategy has always been led by US FDA first, unless there have been nuances in either the science or where the company wants to go first.
I want to kind of bring it a bit back towards your journey and the things you've learned as we head towards the end of the interview. When we spoke, you mentioned that one of the reasons you were brought into Galderma was to help advance the immunology business using the lessons you had learned from the oncology business that you were in before. And oncology, as you rightly mentioned, often moves quicker from a regulatory perspective.
Yes.
And some of the ideas are now influencing other therapeutic areas. For you personally, what has oncology regulatory taught you about the strategy that can be applied to other therapeutic areas like immunology and others, for example?
Yeah, that's an exciting shift that is happening right now, I will have to say, from a regulatory landscape perspective, right? There are a lot of cross-pollination, a lot of cross-learnings that we're taking. And I think oncology has essentially been that proving ground for a lot of regulatory flexibility. We have seen novel endpoints. We have seen accelerated approvals. We have seen like surrogate endpoints for long-standing, long-term outcomes. So for me, I think where I'm truly seeing that shift and that cross-pollination that is happening right now is in the rare disease space, in also the immunology space. I think there has been a real movement this year. FDA has been running some great workshops that are focused on advancing this novel surrogate endpoints for rare disease development. We have seen a lot of those happen in oncology. Seen progression-free survival being used as a validated surrogate for overall survival because of how amazingly the drugs work, and the OS data takes a longer time to come in. So I think I'm seeing that shift. I'm seeing that cross-pollination right now happen with the rare disease space, where we're also starting, just like oncology, to use biomarker data, natural history data. What are we doing with the animal modeling? We're trying to get away from using a lot of larger preclinical packages. We have the M15 guidance that just came in for MIDD, for model-informed dose development. So I think I'm seeing a lot of shift that is happening to support that benefit-risk case when it comes to those traditional longer duration trials that are just simply not feasible anymore, either because of a small patient population or because of the amount of drugs that we already have in the market. So I'm thinking that right now the agency is really building up to that level of comfort and a track record where this kind of flexibility and evidence-based decision-making that happened in oncology is also coming into immunology and rare diseases. And it's almost to the point where now we are starting to see these biomarker strategies come in. We're trying to understand more about these mechanism of action of drugs that have been approved for a long time and where else they can benefit. So I think oncology has been a great playing field for that. And because I have trained mostly in oncology, I can speak out of experience that, it's often not decades of data that you require, but it's informed data. It's the robust science that we invest in that is required. It's not going to be a true copy paste from oncology, of course. There are going to be caveats. We have to understand like cross pollination is just not borrowing a pathway. Hey, I just want to get the same pathway as oncology. It's borrowing a mindset and the willingness to build that scientific case for a novel endpoint, the willingness to collect that data for a long time, and then to have that conversation and show what meaningful benefit looks like in a particular disease. I think that's what's truly happening right now.
And so, why does oncology tend to move faster from a regulatory perspective? And what lessons translate outside of oncology well, and what doesn't translate as easily?
Yeah, I think one of the areas that oncology has been so fast is because we are dealing with patients that have very little time left and are in dire need of a drug that actually works. So that's the biggest motivation. If you think about cancer patients, if you think about the amount of chemotherapy cycles that they've gone into, the quality of life matters, the overall survival matters. And I think that's why we have been so comfortable in oncology with the ambiguity, with not knowing everything right from the start, but been okay building upon it. I think that mindset now is also shifting with the other therapeutic areas, with the amount of resources and the tools that we have. We have obviously not only made advancements in science and the way we understand science, but we have made tremendous advancements with AI and how quickly we can know about a pathway or discover a target or know whether this molecule is truly going to work or not. So I think with that advancement and with that totality, it's becoming increasingly common for FDA, EMA, and others to recognize that it is okay to play initially in that little bit of ambiguity when it is supported by the right evidence and the right framework on modeling and simulation and the evidence generation that we get.
You mentioned the idea of cross-pollination between therapeutic areas. Are we seeing regulatory approach for oncology become more accepted elsewhere? And in particular, where are you seeing that most clearly?
Yeah, I think that I would say less as oncology tools being exported almost in a way, but more as oncology has proved that this kind of regulatory flexibility is possible and almost productive. Now that there are other therapeutic areas, like you mentioned, and I work on those as well, that are doing the harder work to figure out what it looks like for their own diseases, whether it be the model in dose development, whether it be developing drugs for pediatrics, whether it be going into very rare disease space where we were struggling to enroll 100 patients, but now because of the flexibility that we have seen in oncology, we could possibly just enroll half the sample size of that and support it with generative, confirmatory evidence, supportive evidence, real world data. I think that cross-pollination is being drawn from a mindset perspective, more from a tools perspective, because the tools were somewhat always there. The mindset shift didn't happen until oncology proved that it could. And it worked. And that's where I truly and honestly feel is the space that really excites me a lot about the rare disease space and the work that we are all doing, because we're building that database, the database that oncology built over several years to ultimately get to a point where even with ambiguity, we would be comfortable dealing in complex situations from a regulatory standpoint as well.
And how do you avoid forcing, say, that oncology tools and framework approach into a therapeutic area where it doesn't fit?
I think just relying on faster pathways just to get into the market quickly. I think the mindset, again, has to be that we are doing this research, we are doing this work ultimately for patients that are human beings that require those medicines to improve on their disease, to improve the quality of life. So just taking an oncology tool and saying, I want an accelerated pathway because it will get me quickly into the market and it's just going to have my medicine on in all of these countries is not going to cut it. I think there has to be a robust rationale. There has to be a true need for that to occur. And we are seeing that from the FDA side as well, that accelerated approvals are being scrutinized. It's not just about showcasing a data set and getting approved, but it's also about showing the FDA on how you're going to build upon that data set by doing the confirmatory studies, by already enrolling into the confirmatory studies by the time your AA pathway is going to get approved. So I think it's more about the mindset of the destination is the patients. Let's not use shortcuts to get there. Let science drive you to get there. And if there is a pathway that can help science get there faster, let's use that.
I want to kind of, for this last question, just look at the therapeutic landscape in general of oncology. You've mentioned a few times about the different pathways, how quickly things can go, and the landscape can shift incredibly quickly with new standards of care, combinations, biomarkers. One competitor maybe having a really great phase 2, phase 3 data, and everyone's running to try that area. How does that create regulatory and development challenges, particularly for smaller companies? Because obviously they're a bit more limited in the information they have access to and the SMEs they can have access to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have faced some of those firsthand in smaller companies with lesser resources, leaner teams, not having the insights, not having the capabilities. I think one of the biggest challenges is when you think about these pilots that FDA brings forward, we generally see that the larger companies definitely get involved into the pilot. But that does not truly encompass the entire scope of the entire industry that might have to follow the same regulation or real-time adverse event reporting or real-time submission, etc. So I think one of the things that I truly feel would be helpful is that more engagement from the smaller companies as well. And this has always been a catch-22 where we don't want to engage early, but we also want to engage early. And how do we do that? And how do we find that balance? And I think using consortiums like, biopharma that do such great work with the industry, Friends of Cancer for oncology, I think just having that little bit of collaboration within the smaller companies to also be part of pilots would be extremely helpful, because that would truly give us a real world experience of what would happen if a pilot truly becomes a guidance. The second thing is that I always try to advise my team is don't shy away from an FDA engagement. And you don't have to have milestone engagements all the time. You can have pipeline meetings. You can have a general discussion that you go to the FDA or MHRA or to the EMA and ask them some forward-looking questions. And I know that the agency is very happy to engage when the time is right and when the science is novel. So that is one other thing for smaller companies that I would always recommend, that find a time that is right to engage and present your pipeline or present your views or present your areas of difficulties to the FDA and try to gain some insights from them. I had the opportunity at AstraZeneca to lead a pediatric pipeline meeting with them, and that was extremely useful after the RACE Act that came in 2020. And it was extremely important for us to understand agencies' thinking on now oncology drugs also being developed for pediatric indications, whether they're relevant in pediatrics or not. If your MOA is relevant, you are developing it. So I think those type of engagements also help smaller companies, I feel. Obviously, when the time is right. Now, I do understand that they are resource constrained and it's not always easy to manage competing priorities and multiple priorities. But having set these few milestones along the way within the regulatory strategy is also very helpful for the teams to understand that they're going to have to block a chunk of their resources for this time in order to get some early collaborative engagement, either from the FDA or from their industry partners, or be part of comments when they go back to the agency. So I think that proactive level of engagement from smaller to mid-sized companies would be great so that we can see a full spectrum of comments and pain points and feedback that can come across from the industry and not just large pharmas.
What happens if a trial design that looked appropriate at the start becomes less compelling by the time the data reads out?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. The change in landscape is always a difficult one when you have to think about trials being already enrolled or trials that are almost about to read out, and then you have difficult conversation with the agency that this might not be relevant. And I think where it is truly important is to understand that the challenges that the drug development timelines are measured in years. The science evolves in months. So a trial that was completely appropriate when it was designed may face challenges later when they don't have a control arm, or the clinical practice is not relevant anymore. And I think the companies really need to continuously assess the external landscape and maintain a close dialogue with regulators. I know I have said this multiple times throughout your podcast, Corner, but I truly feel that building that within the DNA of a company is extremely important, because the goal here is not to predict the future. None of us have a crystal ball. I think what we really want to do is avoid being locked into assumptions that no longer are true when the data ultimately arrives. So it's very hard for smaller companies, because they don't have unlimited amount of resources, to just change the standard of care or just throw away a trial that made sense a year ago or do a protocol amendment. And I think that is why they have to make very deliberate decisions about where to invest and how much risk are they willing to take. And if a standard of care changes, yeah, you monitor the external landscapes. You have that dialogue with the FDA. You come to a resolution while your trial is still running, and not wait until the data has already arrived and you cannot go back and change anything.
Following on from that then, how should companies think about competitor data, emerging combinations, or say like biomarker shifts when they're already committed to an ongoing study? I mean, we're always looking what everyone else is doing, and what if they're doing would actually be good if we done it as well? Like, how do you handle that?
Look, you don't want to overreact at every new data set that comes along your way, but I would say you can't even ignore it. So the best companies that I have noticed have a disciplined process for continuously evaluating external developments and asking, does this change the clinical relevance of our study? So every time you see a new data come in, ask a question. Is this our target population? Is this our commercial positioning? Is this our target product profile? And is this truly going to change what we are doing in the trial? Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes it is a yes. And if that's a yes, it would mean that you're adjusting your future cohorts. You're either adding another subgroup, you're changing the way that you're analyzing your data now, or you're even taking learnings from that and planning your next study differently. I think the key is balancing consistency in execution with adaptability in strategy. And I always say this to my teams, right? That none of us can predict what is going to happen in the future, but we have to be aware enough and nimble enough where we can adapt it within our existing strategy. Because as you know, in oncology or in any other field, you're not just developing a drug, you are actually developing something that can go against a landscape that's evolving underneath your feet. And you have to be quick.
Bhargavi, that takes us to the end of the episode. I thank you very much. I do have some quick fire questions for you before I let you go, if that's all right with you.
Yes, absolutely.
First one for you is, what career advice do you wish you had received earlier?
I think I have been very fortunate that I have had the opportunity to work in different therapeutic areas with different people within different landscapes. And I have also been very fortunate that sometimes I have been hired for potential and not expertise. The one thing that I would say would be, don't think that you cannot learn in any area that you want. I think learning is constant, whether your passion is in oncology, immunology. I think learning is always going to be there. You're going to adapt. You're going to also translate that learning. So maybe the one career advice that I got it in an implied way, but would be nice to get more explicitly, is you are not defined by what you're doing right now. Be open, keep learning, and the right doors are always going to open for you at the right time.
Always be a student, my dad used to say.
Absolutely. Always be a student. We're all students.
If we were having this conversation again in 10 years' time, what do you think would have changed the most in regulatory affairs?
Oh, that's a fun one to think about. Honestly, I think a lot of what we have talked today really provides those early signals into what I think are going to be bigger shifts. The first thing that I think will change is the relationship between the regulatory authorities and data. So right now, as we mentioned, we build a package, we send it to the agency. I think in 10 years, that's going to become much more continuous. We are already seeing the steps happen in that direction, but I think it's going to advance very quickly. I think companies and regulators essentially are just going to be co-developing evidence in real time with modeling, with real world AI assisted reviews. So I think that's really going to be a shift in 10 years in the way we think about data and in the way we collaborate with regulatory agencies. The M15 guidance that I talked about a little bit in the podcast too is also just a real formal step in that direction. The second shift, sorry.
No, sorry, I interrupted. I thought you stopped. Go ahead.
The second shift that I think, the one personally that I am really excited about is what novel endpoints mean. So right now, getting a new endpoint accepted, whether it's in oncology that I've worked on before and I've done that, or in rare diseases, immunology, I think it's still a major undertaking. It requires years of data, a complex dialogue with the agency. And I think in 10 years, the infrastructure for validating those novel endpoints, and especially with the digitalization and the AI that we have right now, will be very mature enough that it becomes much faster and almost becomes routine part of development rather than this multi-year strategic project that you're thinking about years and years in advance. And I think that, if we think about it, has huge implications, especially rare disease space where we are waiting for a traditional endpoint and sometimes we just don't have options for patients. So that really excites me on things that could happen in 10 years.
And lastly, what part of working in regulatory affairs do you enjoy the most?
I think for me, the best part about working in regulatory is being this liaison between the different functions internally. Understanding and grasping data, working on novel mechanism of actions, and then translating that into a story and into a package to the health authorities to really provide these drugs to the patients. Being a pharmacist by training, I have been bound by this patient-centric mentality. So for me, actually seeing this whole process come live where I can be a part of it and ultimately deliver something to a patient that is going to help them with their quality of life, with their survival, is most fulfilling. So for me, that's exciting, that motivates me, and that's what I'm passionate about every day.
And what a great way to end the episode. Bhargavi, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I genuinely had a really great time. I hope you did as well.
I absolutely had a great time talking with you, Connor. Thank you for such insightful questions, and I cannot wait to see where we advance in the field of regulatory next.
Me too. And for anybody watching now, feel free to connect with Bhargavi on LinkedIn or myself. If you have any questions you would like to ask, feel free to put it in the comments or to send them directly. We look forward to speaking with you. And Bhargavi, I look forward to having you back on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you so much.